Blood soaked into the veined marble floor of the High Council chamber,
I have been
pooling in the
searching
cracks
for
between
you.
the tiles
I knew
like
you would
dark
come.
wine spilled at a funeral. It was the only color left in a room that had once been famous across 17 star systems for its blinding whiteness: white columns, white thrones, white banners stitched with silver thread. Now the white was stained red and gray with ash, and the silence that filled the hall was the particular, suffocating silence that only follows absolute defeat. The war was over. For 7 years, the sovereign empire, a civilization that had built its entire identity on genetic perfection, aesthetic supremacy, and a casual generational cruelty it never bothered to hide, had tried to erase humanity from the galactic ledger. They had called Earth's people vermin, backward apes who bred too fast and thought too slow, unworthy of the stars they had only just learned to reach. The sovereigns had come to conquer, expecting a massacre. They got a war instead, and they lost it. Now their capital's grand pillars lay cracked open like broken ribs, sunlight bleeding through holes punched by orbital strikes. King Alistair, absolute ruler of the sovereign empire, knelt in the wreckage of his own stained glass windows, the shards glittering around his silk robes like a crown of broken promises. Major Richard Cole stood a few paces away, his combat armor scorched black along one shoulder plate, his breathing slow and even despite 3 days without real sleep. His eyes, a flat, weathered gray, the color of a sky before a storm nobody wants, moved across the room with the calm, unhurried attention of a man cataloging threats rather than admiring victory. Earth's terms had already been dictated. General David Montgomery, Supreme Commander of Earth's Expeditionary Forces, stood at the head of the human delegation, his voice carrying the exhausted authority of a man who had buried too many soldiers to feel triumphant about anything anymore. To close the treaty, and if the diplomats back on Earth were honest with themselves, to humiliate a species that had spent 7 years calling humans savages, Earth had invoked an old sovereign custom, one written into their own legal code centuries before humanity had even discovered fire. The right of conquest's due. The single greatest warrior of the victorious army was entitled to claim one prize from the defeated royal household: a relic, a weapon, a person. It was meant, in sovereign tradition, as the ultimate mark of dominance, to take the enemy's most treasured possession and parade it as a trophy. General Montgomery had given that honor to Cole. It hadn't been a hard decision. It was Cole's battalion that broke the siege at the Orion colonies when 3 other divisions had already been chewed apart. It was Cole who had lost 300 of his best soldiers in the freezing mud of the Vesport trenches, while, less than 4 kilometers away, the sovereign nobility sipped luminous wine from crystal stemware and watched the battle from a viewing gallery like it was theater. Cole had earned this, whatever this turned out to be. King Alistair swallowed hard, his composure, the same composure that had once commanded 17 worlds, visibly cracking down the middle. Desperate to salvage even a sliver of political leverage from the ashes of his empire, he had ordered his 3 daughters brought before the dais and arranged like merchandise on a shelf. They were meant to be living peace offerings, brides for the conquerors, dressed to remind Earth exactly what it was they'd be getting. First in line stood Princess Genevieve, eldest daughter of the royal house. She was, by any measure the sovereigns valued, perfection made flesh, tall, symmetrical, with the kind of ethereal, unsettling beauty that sovereign genetic engineers spent centuries refining. Her chin was lifted even in surrender, her spine straight, her pale eyes glittering with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite defiance. It was calculation. Beside her stood Princess Victoria, the middle daughter, whose sharp eyes flicked across the ranks of human soldiers with the restless energy of someone already drafting a strategy. She had the look of a woman deciding which of these armored giants would be easiest to manipulate once the cameras stopped rolling. Both women wore garments of spun gold thread and shimmering starlight weave fabric, dresses that cost more than most Earth colonies' annual budgets, and both wore them like a birthright, like the fabric itself owed them deference. And then there was the third daughter. She stood half a step behind her sisters, tucked into the shadow thrown by a broken pillar, as though trying to disappear into the stone itself. Princess Abigail. She did not share her sister's effortless height. A childhood illness, one the sovereign medical caste had refused to properly treat, because treating it would have meant admitting that a of the royal bloodline could be flawed, had left a visible curve in her spine, a permanent stoop that no amount of posture training could fully hide. A jagged plasma burn scar traced down the left side of her neck and vanished beneath the high collar of a plain, ash-gray dress that had clearly never been tailored to flatter anyone. She leaned her weight onto a simple wooden cane, and her eyes, a striking molten silver that neither of her sisters shared, stayed fixed on the floor, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. In a society that worshipped symmetry and genetic flawlessness as though they were religious virtues, Abigail was an embarrassment, a smudge on an otherwise pristine portrait. She had spent 24 years kept out of public broadcasts, diplomatic functions, and formal portraits, a ghost with a royal bloodline and none of its privileges. Major Cole. General Montgomery's voice rolled through the shattered hall, bouncing off broken marble. The right is yours. Claim your prize so we can sign the armistice and get off this rock. King Alistair gave Genevieve a small, urgent nudge forward. She responded instantly, arranging her face into a dazzling, rehearsed smile, the kind that promised power, influence, and things men were supposed to want. The sovereign empire offers its finest, Alistair said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound regal. Take my eldest, Commander. She will serve as a symbol of our new unity. Cole didn't so much as glance at her. His boots crunched over broken glass as he walked past the king, past the golden daughters standing like showroom pieces, and came to a stop directly in front of the shadow behind the pillar. Abigail flinched as the massive human loomed over her, gripping her cane so tightly her knuckles went bone-white. Sovereign propaganda had spent 7 years telling its citizens that humans were savage animals, flesh-eaters who bathed in the blood of the conquered. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a blow or worse. Herg Cole said. The word landed like a dropped weapon. A collective gasp rippled through the surviving sovereign courtiers. Duke Reginald, a portly nobleman standing near the back, audibly choked on his own breath. King Alistair's jaw fell open. Genevieve's flawless face twisted for just a moment into something ugly. Alistair sputtered, abandoning every scrap of diplomatic composure. Major, surely you jest. That is Abigail. She is defective, crippled. She holds no political value, no beauty to grace your halls. She is a shadow. Please take Genevieve. Take the crown jewels. Take anything else. Cole turned his head slowly toward the king, his expression unreadable but his eyes gone hard as flint. I didn't ask for an inventory report, he said. I made my choice. He looked back down at Abigail. She had finally opened her eyes, staring up at him with a tangled mix of terror and confusion, so raw it was almost painful to watch. Why would the conqueror choose the reject? Cole extended a hand, a massive, armored, scarred hand, palm up, toward her. He didn't grab, he didn't assert, he simply waited. Come with me, princess, he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. You're done being a ghost in this house. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, pressing them against the cold metal of his gauntlet. His grip, when it closed around her hand, was surprisingly gentle. He adjusted his stride to match her limp without being asked, without a flicker of impatience, as they walked past her stunned family toward the shattered doors. Genevieve hissed as they passed. You would choose garbage over a goddess human. Cole stopped. He looked the beautiful princess up and down with open, undisguised disgust. I've seen enough polished statues in this city, he said, and I know exactly what hides behind them. I'll take the one who actually knows how to bleed. He didn't wait for a response. He led Abigail out through the ruined palace doors, leaving the self-declared masters of the galaxy choking on the dust of their own broken pride. The cold, utilitarian steel of the USS Saratoga replaced marble and gold almost the instant the shuttle doors sealed shut. Earth's premier dreadnought was a flying fortress of angular bulkheads, flashing amber warning strips, and the low, constant hum of heavily shielded fusion engines. A sound that felt, to Abigail, less like a machine and more like a massive, sleeping animal. For a sovereign princess who had spent her entire life inside marble halls that smelled of floral incense and quiet cruelty, it was an alien world in the truest sense. As Cole guided her through the hangar bay, hundreds of human soldiers stopped mid-task to stare. They were enormous, broad-shouldered, clad in dark gray fatigues and half-removed exosuits, weapons racked along the bulkheads that looked capable of leveling city blocks. Abigail braced herself instinctively for jeers, for cruel laughter. For the kind of casual mockery she'd endured her entire life from the lower sovereign castes, whenever her deformity was visible. Instead, something strange happened. As Cole walked her down the central corridor, the soldiers snapped upright, one after another, boots slamming together, hands crossing sharply over their chests in salute. "Major on deck," a voice barked from somewhere down the hall. Not one of them looked at Abigail with disgust. If anything, what she saw in their eyes was quiet curiosity, and something that looked almost like respect, though she couldn't imagine what she'd done to earn it. Cole led her past busy engineering bays, past a mess hall filled with the smell of something warm and unfamiliar, and into the officers' residential sector. He stopped at a heavy blast door and keyed in a code. It hissed open, revealing a surprisingly spacious room, a real bed with thick woolen blankets, a small desk cluttered with data slates, and a viewport that framed the endless dark and the distant scattered stars. It was not a cell. It was, unmistakably, someone's home. "These are my quarters," Cole said, stepping aside to let her in. "I've had my things moved to the junior officers' barracks. You'll be safe here. The lock works from the inside. Nobody comes in unless you want them to." Abigail stood frozen in the doorway, both hands wrapped around her cane. Her mind, shaped by a lifetime of quiet conditioning, immediately began searching for the trap hidden somewhere in this kindness. "I do not understand, Major Cole," she said finally. "Call me Richard," he said, reaching up to unclasp the heavy collar of his armor. Up close, without the adrenaline of the throne room, he looked exhausted, deep lines carved around his eyes, the particular tiredness of a man who had spent years fighting a war he never asked to fight. "And what don't you understand? Why did you claim me?" Her voice came out fragile, barely more than a whisper. "I am damaged. My father said it himself. I cannot bear strong children. I cannot stand at galas and be beautiful for your leaders. If you wanted a servant, there were thousands of stronger ones in that hall. What use am I to a conqueror?" Richard stopped mid-motion, one gauntlet half off. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. He reached into a tactical pouch on his belt and pulled out a small, battered surveillance drone no larger than a songbird, setting it gently on the desk between them. "2 days ago, during the final bombardment," he said, "my unit was tasked with mapping the palace's structural weak points. We flew drones through the lower ventilation shafts. I spent hours watching the feeds." Abigail's eyes widened slightly. "I saw," he stopped, cleared his throat, and continued, his voice tightening with something he was visibly working to control. "I saw the royal family retreat to the deep bunkers. King Alistair, Genevieve, Victoria. They took the elite guard and sealed the blast doors behind them, but they left the palace servants behind. Hundreds of them, trapped in the upper levels while our artillery came down." He took a step closer. "But I saw you. You didn't go to the bunker. I watched through a drone camera for 3 hours as you dragged wounded servants into the reinforced cellars. You tore your own robes to make bandages. You gave up your rations to people who would never have done the same for you. I watched you carry a child down 3 flights of stairs on that bad leg of yours while the ceiling was coming apart above you." Abigail looked away, her cheeks flushing a pale, iridescent silver, her species equivalent of a blush, or perhaps of shame. "They were terrified," she said quietly. "Someone had to help them. My family, they do not see the servants as living things. Not really." "Exactly," Richard said, his voice softening further. "When General Montgomery told me to pick a prize, I already knew I wasn't taking one of those arrogant sociopaths back to Earth. My people have shed too much blood to babysit tyrants for the next decade. But you," he shook his head slightly, like even he found it hard to explain. "You have a soldier's heart, Abigail. You protected people who couldn't protect themselves at cost to yourself, with nothing to gain from it. That makes you more human than anyone I met in that entire palace." Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill. For 24 years she had been called a monster, a mistake, a stain that the royal bloodline could never quite scrub clean. This terrifying human warlord, this supposed savage from the stories her tutors had told her since childhood, was the first person in her entire life to call her something else. To call her worthy. Before she could find her voice to respond, a sharp, piercing alarm cut through the quiet room, blaring from the communicator strapped to Richard's wrist. He frowned, tapping the screen. "Cole here. What is it, Dr. Evans?" The voice of the ship's chief medical officer crackled through, tight and urgent. "Major, we just ran the standard bioscans from the airlock when you brought the Sovereign Royal aboard. You need to get her to medical. Right now." "Why? She's malnourished, she limps, she's stable." "It's not her health, Major. It's her blood chemistry." A pause heavy with dread. "The automated scanners picked up a synthetic isotope embedded in her lower spine. Major, she's carrying a localized antimatter charge. A smart bomb, organic casing, tied to her cardiac rhythm." Richard's blood ran cold. "They booby-trapped her, Richard," Dr. Evans said grimly through the comm. "The king knew you'd take a prize, someone in that room. He must have had his surgeons implant a fail-safe device in the daughter he considered expendable, on the off chance she was the one chosen. If we break orbit, or if her heart rate spikes into a full panic response, it detonates. The yield is more than enough to vaporize the entire command deck of this ship." Silence swallowed the room. Abigail stared at Richard, uncomprehending for one merciful second, and then the meaning of the words landed like a physical blow. Her cane clattered to the metal floor. Her father hadn't just discarded her. He hadn't merely given her away to buy himself time. He had turned her into a weapon, meant to detonate and take Earth's command structure with her when she died. She was to him less than nothing, not even a daughter, a delivery mechanism. Her chest began to heave, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The wrist monitor on Richard's arm started chirping faster, matching the sudden, terrified acceleration of her pulse. "Abigail, look at me." Richard dropped to one knee in front of her, gripping her shoulders, his voice suddenly a low, steady anchor in the storm. "Look at my eyes. Breathe." He wants me dead," she sobbed, panic tearing through her composure like a wave through a sandcastle. "I'm a bomb. I'm going to kill you. You have to throw me out the airlock. Please, Richard, eject me. Save your people." "I am not throwing you anywhere," Richard said, his voice rising over the shrieking proximity alarm without losing an ounce of its steadiness. "You are under my protection. Evans, prep a surgical bay now. Have the autodoc ready for spinal extraction. Major, if she panics, the fail-safe." "I said prep the damn bay." He cut the comm. He looked at the weeping, hyperventilating princess in front of him, and without a second's hesitation, he pulled her forward into a tight, grounding embrace, pressing her head against his chest, directly over the steady drum of his own heart. "Listen to my heartbeat," he ordered, gentler now. "Listen to it, Abigail. Slow yours down to match mine. You are not a weapon. You are not a mistake. You are going to live, and I swear to God, we are going to make your father pay for what he did to you. But right now, I need you to fight." Abigail closed her eyes, focusing every scrap of failing strength on the steady, human rhythm thudding against her cheek. Slowly, painfully, her own racing heart began to fall into step with his. Alarms blared in a deafening crescendo as Richard sprinted down the metallic corridors of the Saratoga, carrying Princess Abigail in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. She was startlingly light, her fragile frame trembling violently against his armored chest. Medical personnel scrambled out of his path, flattening against bulkheads as he barreled through the automatic doors of the primary trauma bay. Dr. Jonathan Evans was already shouting orders. The chief medical officer had trained at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center back on Earth, specializing in battlefield cybernetics and explosive trauma, a veteran of the worst meat grinders the war had offered. Even his face had gone pale as he directed Richard toward the central surgical table. "Lay her on her stomach gently," Evans commanded, pulling on a pair of haptic feedback gloves. "Mitchell, get the neurogel prepped. We need to stabilize her nervous system before that thing decides her heart rate is a threat." Richard lowered Abigail carefully onto the sterile table. Her skin, usually a flawless pearlescent hue, had taken on a sickly ashen tint. She was hyperventilating, her fingers digging desperately into the sleeve of Richard's shirt, refusing to let go. "Richard," she gasped, her voice breaking. "It burns, my spine, it feels like it's on fire." "I'm right here," Richard said, refusing to step back even as frantic nurses tried to maneuver a surgical laser rig into place around him. He leaned over her, keeping his face in her line of sight, his thumb stroking gently over her white-knuckled hand. "Look at me. Keep your eyes on me." "Major, you need to clear the sterile field," Evans said, eyes locked on a holographic scan projecting above Abigail's exposed lower back. "I'm not leaving her, Doc," Richard growled in a toned th. It left no room for argument. "She needs an anchor. If she panics, we all turn to vapor." Evans didn't push further. He zoomed the hologram in. The image displayed Abigail's curved spine and wrapped around her lower vertebrae, a parasitic, glowing mechanical mass pulsed with a sickly, toxic green light. "God in heaven," Evans whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. "This isn't a standard explosive. It's a sovereign bioweapon, a synthetic parasite. It's literally fused itself into her spinal cord. If I try to cut it out directly, it triggers a localized antimatter reaction. If I hit it with an EMP, it eats through her central nervous system before it even has the chance to detonate. This is assassination-grade tech." "Can you disarm it?" Richard demanded, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. "Not safely," Evans said, fingers flying across a console, running frantic calculations. "It's feeding off her sovereign biology. It recognizes her specific protein markers. To trick it into shutting down, I need to starve it. I have to fundamentally alter her blood chemistry so the device thinks its host is already dead. That puts it into a dormant state long enough for me to extract it." "Then do it." "You don't understand, Major. We don't carry sovereign blood aboard this ship. The only way to alter her chemistry fast enough, inside the next 3 minutes, is a massive cross-species transfusion. We'd have to flood her system with human blood, heavily laced with synthetic adrenaline and radiation scrubbers." He hesitated. "The rejection rate could stop her heart before the parasite ever wakes up." "If you do nothing, we all die anyway," Abigail whispered, her voice suddenly, surprisingly steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She looked up at Richard with silver eyes full of heartbreaking resignation. "Do it, Doctor. My father made me a monster. If I die, at least I die surrounded by people who tried to save me instead of people who wanted me dead." Something tightened in Richard's chest that had nothing to do with combat stress. He rolled up his sleeve, exposing a thick, scarred forearm. "My blood type's O-negative. Universal donor back home. Will it work?" "It's a massive risk," Evans warned. Human red blood cells carry iron. Sovereign blood is copper-based. We'll have to push a brutal dose of immunosuppressants into her system just to keep her body from rejecting it outright. It will be the most painful thing she's ever experienced. "Strap my arm to the line," Richard said. "Do it now." Within seconds, thick plastic tubing connected Richard's vein to Abigail's. Evans slammed the override on the medical console. The machines hummed violently as human blood, packed with experimental Earth combat stimulants, began pumping directly into the alien princess's body. Abigail threw her head back and screamed, a sound that shattered the sterile silence of the medical bay. Her back arched violently as the iron-rich human blood hit her copper-based system like a freight train. Every nerve in her body ignited at once. "Hold her down," Evans shouted. "The parasite's reacting, it's trying to burrow deeper." Richard threw his upper body across hers, pinning her shoulders to the table to keep her from breaking her own spine. "Abigail, stay with me. Fight it." His voice cracked with something raw as he felt the unnatural heat radiating off her skin. The holographic monitor flashed violent red and amber. Confused by the sudden influx of foreign DNA and combat-grade adrenaline, the parasite loosened its grip on her spinal column, slipping into a defensive hibernation state. "It's detaching," Evans yelled, grabbing a specialized laser scalpel. "I have a window, 10 seconds. Richard held his breath, maintaining his desperate grip on the thrashing princess as Evans sliced into her lower back with the precise, brutal efficiency of a Walter Reed-trained trauma surgeon. Forceps plunged into the incision and ripped the pulsing green device free in one motion. Evans hurled it into a shielded biocontainment cylinder and slammed the lock shut. Abigail went completely limp. The heart monitor flatlined, screaming a single high-pitched note. "She's in cardiac arrest. The human blood is overwhelming her system," Mitchell shouted, already grabbing the defibrillator paddles. "Clear," Evans shouted, sending a violent shock through her chest. Her body jolted. The monitor stayed flat. "Come on, you stubborn girl," Richard pleaded, his voice fracturing. "Don't you let him win. Don't let your father win. Charge to 300, clear." Evans hit her again. Silence hung over the room for one endless, agonizing second. Then the monitor gave a weak, stuttering beep. Then another. Slowly, rhythmically, her heart began to beat again, kept alive by the blood of the conqueror who had refused to give her up. Consciousness returned to Abigail in slow, fractured waves. The first thing she registered was the smell of antiseptic and steri. Lysed steel, so different from the cloying floral perfumes that had drifted through her father's palace her entire life. The second thing she noticed was an absence. A sharp, grinding pain had lived in her lower spine and left leg for as long as she could remember, a constant reminder of her supposed imperfection. Now there was only a strange, warm numbness. She blinked her eyes open. The harsh lighting of the medical bay had been dimmed. Sitting in a metal chair beside her bed, still wearing his blood-stained fatigue pants and a black undershirt, was Richard. He was fast asleep, chin dropped to his chest, exhaustion having finally caught up with him. One of his massive hands rested gently over hers. Carefully, so as not to wake him, Abigail shifted her legs beneath the thick blanket. A strange surge of energy ran through them. When she moved her left leg, the crippled limb that had required a cane for 15 years, it responded with smooth, painless fluidity, as if the pain had simply been erased. "It's the human medtech." A gruff voice spoke from the shadows near the door. Abigail startled, turning her head. Standing there, arms crossed over a chest weighted with decades of medals, was General David Montgomery. The supreme commander of Earth's forces stepped into the dim light, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Dr. Evans had to rebuild 3 of your vertebrae with carbon fiber synthetics," he explained quietly, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Richard. "Combined with the transfusion, your body essentially went into biological overdrive. Your own medical caste deemed you a lost cause because using cybernetics wasn't considered elegant. Earth doctors don't much care about elegance. We care about survival. Abigail slowly sat up, marveling at the newfound strength in her own back. I am fixed. You're upgraded, Princess, Montgomery said, his tone shifting into something graver. But we have a much bigger problem now. We analyzed the device Dr. Evans pulled out of you. Earth Command in Geneva reviewed the telemetry. That charge was armed remotely by a command signal originating from King Alistair's personal bunker on the planet's surface, roughly 40 minutes after you boarded this ship. Richard stirred, snapping awake with the instant alertness of a career soldier. He registered Montgomery's presence and shot to his feet, saluting on reflex. At ease, Major. Montgomery waved him down. I was just updating our guest on the political situation. Did Geneva confirm it? Richard asked, voice roughening with barely contained fury. They did, Montgomery said. The assassination attempt constitutes an act of supreme treachery under the terms of the armistice. The treaty is void. Earth Command has ordered the immediate resumption of hostilities, but we're not going to glass the planet from orbit. We want Alistair alive. We want him standing trial before a war tribunal on Earth, in front of every camera we own. Abigail gripped the edge of her blanket. He is in the deep vault, a bunker buried 3 miles beneath the palace foundations, surrounded by a triphase energy shield. Your orbital bombardments cannot scratch it. Even your ground troops would take months to dig through the reinforced titanium. We know, Montgomery sighed, rubbing his temples. Our tactical analysts say a direct assault is suicide. We'd lose 50,000 soldiers just breaching the front door. You don't need to breach the front door, Abigail said softly. Both men turned to stare at her. She threw the blanket off her legs and swung them over the side of the bed, planting her bare feet on the cold metal floor. She stood up. For the first time in her entire life, she stood perfectly straight, unassisted by any cane, looking a human general directly in the eye. My entire life, my family treated me like a ghost, Abigail said, her voice devoid of its former fragility, replaced by something colder, sharper. Because I was invisible, they never bothered hiding their secrets from me. I know the subterranean maintenance tunnels. I know the geothermal exhaust vents. And I know the master bypass codes for the energy shields. Because my sister Genevieve was too lazy to memorize her own security protocols and made me recite them for her instead, over and over, until I knew them better than she ever did. Richard stepped forward, a dangerous smirk spreading slowly across his face. Are you saying you can get us inside, Abigail? Give me armor, Major Cole. Her silver eyes blazed with a new, terrifying resolve. Give me a weapon. I will walk you directly into my father's throne room. 2 hours later, the hangar bay of the Saratoga was a chaotic symphony of war. Sirens howled, loading mechs stomped across the grated deck, and the sharp scent of ozone and weapon-grade propellant filled the air. Richard stood at the ramp of a heavily armored dropship, checking the power cell on his kinetic rifle with practiced hands. Beside him stood a figure that drew the awestruck stares of the entire assembled battalion. Abigail wore a modified set of human light infantry armor, painted matte black, the plating tailored to fit her smaller frame. The advanced servos woven through the suit moved in perfect sync with her newly repaired spine, translating her movement into something fluid and precise. A standard-issue Earth sidearm sat holstered at her hip. She looked nothing like the broken, discarded princess who had boarded this ship only hours before. She looked like an angel of death. Nervous? Richard asked, racking the bolt of his rifle with a satisfying clack. No, Abigail answered calmly, strapping a tactical helmet under her chin. They threw me to the wolves, Richard. They just didn't realize the wolves would teach me how to bite. Listen up, hellhounds, Richard roared, turning to address his elite strike team, 20 of the ship's most decorated soldiers all standing at rigid attention. This is a surgical decapitation strike. We're dropping straight down the planet's geothermal exhaust shaft. We do not stop. We do not engage secondary targets. We push straight to the king's bunker and we bring the sovereign empire to its knees. The soldiers slammed their fists into their chests in a thunderous roar of approval. Abigail stepped onto the dropship, her heart beating in perfect time with the pulse of human vengeance. The ramp sealed behind them, casting the cabin in blood-red combat lighting. As the ship detached from the dreadnought and plummeted toward the planet's surface, Abigail felt a grim smile tug at the corner of her mouth. Her father had wanted to give the humans a prize. He was about to find out exactly what he had thrown away. Flames licked at the dropship's exterior viewports as it plunged down the sovereign capital's geothermal exhaust shaft. Heat alarms wailed through the cramped troop compartment, but the hellhounds sat in absolute silence, weapons locked, faces set. Abigail stood near the cockpit door, eyes fixed on the telemetry streaming across her helmet's heads-up display, guiding the pilot through treacherous, jagged vents with cold precision, calling out course corrections that kept them from being incinerated by the planet's molten core vent. "Pull up, Vector 4, she ordered, voice cutting through the comms channel. "Thrusters at maximum now." Gravity slammed into them as the ship decelerated hard, smashing through a rusted industrial grate before crashing onto the floor of a massive, long-forgotten subterranean cavern. The loading ramp dropped instantly. Richard was first out, rifle raised, scanning the dark, humid expanse of the maintenance catacombs. The rest of the hellhounds flooded out behind him, securing the perimeter with brutal, practiced efficiency. Abigail stepped off the ramp, the servos in her armor purring softly beneath her. She didn't limp. She didn't hesitate. She pointed toward a massive, reinforced blast door half buried under decades of dust and creeping luminescent moss. "That is the secondary maintenance airlock," she said, stepping past the towering human soldiers without a flicker of fear. "It connects directly to the outer ring of the deep vault. My father's royal guard will not be watching it. They consider these tunnels beneath them, literally and figuratively." Richard signaled his men forward. "You heard the princess. We move fast, we move quiet." They navigated the labyrinthine catacombs for 20 minutes, the air growing colder, the architecture shifting from raw stone to the polished, oppressive titanium of the sovereign empire's most secure bunker. Finally, they reached the choke point, a sprawling underground chasm spanned by a single metallic bridge leading toward a shimmering triphase energy shield protecting the vault's primary blast doors. On the far side, a dozen sovereign royal guards stood at attention in heavy golden armor, gripping plasma halberds. "Snipers," Richard whispered over the squad net. "Take the guards. Abigail, get ready on that bypass code." 3 suppressed kinetic rounds cracked through the cavern like thunder. The 3 lead guards dropped instantly, their ceremonial golden armor offering zero protection against Earth's depleted uranium munitions. Chaos erupted. The remaining guards scrambled for cover, spraying blinding bolts of blue plasma across the bridge in wild, panicked arcs. "Covering fire," Richard roared. The hellhounds unleashed a devastating barrage, pinning the elite sovereign soldiers down. "Go, Abigail," Richard shouted, stepping directly into her path to absorb a glancing plasma bolt on his heavy plating. Abigail sprinted across the bridge. The human-engineered cybernetics fused into her spine moved with terrifying grace, propelling her forward faster than any sovereign royal had ever run in their pampered lives. Plasma fire scorched the air around her, but she didn't flinch, didn't slow. She slid into cover beside the shield generator console, fingers flying across the holographic keypad. Genevieve's voice echoed in her memory, a cruel, distant recollection from years ago, mocking her as she forced Abigail to recite the emergency protocols over and over. "Memorize it, little shadow. You are good for nothing else." "Override code Alpha Tango 79 Omega," Abigail whispered to herself, punching in the final sequence. The shimmering blue energy shield flickered, whined, and collapsed. "Shield is down. Breach," Richard bellowed, tossing a shaped thermal charge at the titanium blast doors. The resulting explosion rocked the cavern, blowing the massive doors inward in a shower of molten metal. The hellhounds poured into the deep vault, overwhelming the remaining guards in seconds. The sovereign elite, trained for ceremonial duels and ritual combat, had no answer for the savage, coordinated, close-quarters brutality of human shock troops. Richard stepped through the smoke, rifle leveled at the center of the room. Inside the luxurious, heavily fortified bunker, King Alistair, Princess Genevieve, and Princess Victoria cowered behind a gilded command table, still pristine, still wrapped in untouched silk and glittering jewels. A stark, absurd contrast to the blood and ash coating the humans around them. Alistair's face had gone pale with absolute terror. He had expected the bomb to detonate hours ago. He had expected Earth's leadership to be vaporized somewhere in the void between worlds. Instead, the demons had kicked down his final door. "Lower your weapons," Alistair screamed, trying to muster the last shreds of his shattered regal authority. "I am the Sovereign King. You cannot do this." Richard didn't say a word. He stepped aside, parting the ranks of towering human soldiers. From the smoke and shadow, Abigail walked forward. She pulled off her tactical helmet and let it drop to the polished floor with a heavy clang. Her silver hair fell loose around her face, framing the jagged plasma scar on her neck, and for the first time in her life, her posture was uncompromisingly straight. Genevieve gasped, stumbling backward. "Abigail, how you're walking, you're—" "I am alive," Abigail said, her voice cold and clear in the bunker's stale air. "No thanks to you." King Alistair stared at her, his eyes darting to the heavy black armor she wore, adorned with Earth's insignia. "Abigail, daughter, what have you done? You betrayed your own blood." "You put a bomb in my spine, father." Abigail's tone carried no sorrow now, no fragility, only steel. "You traded me to the humans, hoping I would die and buy you a few more days of power. But you miscalculated. You thought they were savages. You thought they would treat me the way you always did." She stopped just inches from the king, looking down at the man who had spent her entire life tormenting her for the crime of not being perfect. "They didn't break me," she said softly. "They fixed me, and they taught me what true leadership actually looks like." Alistair opened his mouth to speak, but Richard stepped forward, grabbing him by the collar of his silk robes and hauling him effortlessly to his knees. "Alistair of the Sovereign Empire," Richard growled, producing a pair of heavy stasis cuffs. "You are under arrest for war crimes, violation of the armistice, and attempted assassination of Earth Command personnel. You're going to Geneva, and I promise you, humanity's prisons don't have velvet pillows." Genevieve dropped to her knees, weeping hysterically, reaching for Abigail's armored boot. "Abigail, please, we are sisters. Tell them to show mercy. I will serve you. I will be your handmaid in anything." Abigail looked down at her beautiful, perfect sister and saw, for the first time, nothing but a hollow shell. "The Sovereign Empire you knew is dead, Genevieve," she said quietly. "It died the moment you and father decided I was worth throwing away." She turned to Richard, offering him a small, genuine smile that finally reached her silver eyes. "Take them away, Commander. We have a new world to build." Richard locked the cuffs on the screaming king and hauled him to his feet, then looked at Abigail, really looked at her, seeing the absolute strength radiating from a woman who, 12 hours earlier, could barely meet another person's gaze. She was no longer a spoil of war. She was the rightful ruler of her people, tempered in human fire, ready to forge an alliance that would change the shape of the galaxy for generations. "Yes, ma'am," Richard said, tapping his comm. "Command, this is Cole. Jackpot secured. The war is over." 6 months later, the Transition Summit convened in the rebuilt Council Hall of the Sovereign Capital, no longer white marble stained with ash, but a new structure built jointly by Earth engineers and sovereign architects, a deliberate blend of both civilizations' design philosophies. It was, Richard thought, the ugliest beautiful building he'd ever seen. Exactly as it should be. Abigail stood at its center, no longer wearing armor, but a simple, sturdy uniform of her own design, practical fabric in deep charcoal gray, with a single silver thread running along the collar in memory of a color no one in her family had ever loved on her. She had been named Provisional Regent of the Sovereign Reconstruction Council, an unprecedented title for an unprecedented war, ratified by both Earth Command and what remained of the sovereign nobility, most of whom were too frightened of her now to object. King Alistair's trial in Geneva had been broadcast to every corner of both civilizations. It had taken 11 minutes for the tribunal to reach a verdict. Genevieve and Victoria had been stripped of all royal titles and quietly relocated to a Reconstruction labor colony. Not as punishment exactly, Abigail had insisted, but as an education. Let them learn, she'd said, what it feels like to be considered disposable. Richard leaned against a support column at the back of the hall, watching Abigail address a room full of delegates from both species. Steady, articulate, utterly unshaken by the weight of the title she now carried. He still wasn't entirely sure how a discarded princess with a cane and a plasma scar had become the single most important political figure in this system's reconstruction, but he supposed that was rather the point. Nobody had ever bothered looking closely enough to notice what she was capable of. Nobody except him, watching through a drone feed while a city burned. After the session ended and the hall slowly emptied, Abigail crossed the room to where he stood, her stride confident, unassisted, entirely her own. "You're staring, Major," she said, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "Occupational hazard," Richard said. "I keep an eye on things that matter." "Is that what I am now, a thing that matters?" "You were always that," he said. "Your family was just too busy admiring their own reflections to notice." Abigail looked out through the hall's newly installed viewport, toward the reconstructed skyline, toward a horizon that, for the first time in her life, actually belonged to her. "They gave me away thinking I was worthless," she said quietly. "My father built a weapon out of my own spine and called it strategy. And in the end, all he did was hand humanity the one person in that entire palace who actually knew how his empire worked from the inside, and the one person who had every reason in the galaxy to help tear it down. For what it's worth," Richard said, "I'd choose you again, every time, out of every room in that palace, gold statues included." Abigail turned to look at him, her silver eyes bright with something that was no longer fear and no longer grief, but something steadier, something that looked, for the first time, a great deal like hope. "Good," she said, "because you're stuck with me now, Commander. I intend to build something neither of our people ever managed on their own." Outside the viewport, twin suns set over a rebuilt capital, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the silence in the room wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the quiet of something new, finally beginning.